Hey folks, here comes our second lecture for week 6, where we're going to round out our discussion of research methods by talking about research ethics. Research ethics are a super important topic when we're talking about methods and different approaches, just because we want to make sure that we do our best to protect the participants of our research. In the case of the work that we're doing, we're talking about human participants, but obviously lots of other types of research use non-human participants like animals and such that also need to be treated with ethical care too. Human research participants are a topic that actually has a little bit of a gruesome history to it. If you think about going all the way back to World War II, the Nazis, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments that subjected African American men to unethical, dangerous, immoral treatment or lack of treatment for the syphilis that they were suffering from, all the way up into the 1970s, and other research as well that really seemed to question whether or not researchers had thought through the implications of their research. In some cases, there may have been actual ill will intended. In other cases, they were just clueless. They hadn't really thought through the impacts or couldn't see far enough outside of their research question to understand the impacts that would happen, the possible consequences for their research partners. As a consequence of all that, the research ethics process that we have now, to some degree, takes the researcher out of the process of deciding whether or not it's an ethical approach or not, to where we actually have an institutional review board at Colgate, universities all around the country that make those decisions about the appropriate ethical use of research participants in the research that we do. So that's what we're going to talk about here in this lecture. Before we jump into the details of that, though, I just want to say, hey, everybody, enjoy this beautiful fall we're having. We just have a really gorgeous fall transition that's happening right now. I would say that the colors are looking better than they have in the last few falls. My wife, Carolyn, Professor Sue, and I went for a walk up on the Colgate trails over the weekend. It was just so pleasant and peaceful up there. It was just really nice to be walking through the leaves and crunching along the way. So if you haven't been up on the Colgate trails above campus recently, take some time, go on a walk up there. So enjoy this fall weather while we have it. It's really great for self-care and for peace of mind. There's 3 key considerations that we have to take into account when it comes to research ethics and the work that we want to do with human research participants. The first and the real cornerstone of research ethics and the philosophy of it is informed consent. As the name would imply, it's getting consent from our research partners and informing them about what's going to be involved in terms of their participation in research and any risks. So any risks that are part of the research process to their physical person, to their reputation, to their social standing, to their identity, and whether or not people are going to know or not that they participated in the research, what they said. Those are all things that can potentially be risks and that we have to take seriously, and we have to get consent from our research partners that they're going to sign on and say that they understand that before they can get involved. Related to that is that we always want to minimize those risks. It's not to say that there's no risk for research. We can actually have some level of risk, although obviously we want it to be as minimal as possible. But we have to choose research practices and designs that do the minimum in terms of any risks that are faced from participation in our projects. If there is actually any risk, we can still have that as long as it's a legitimate part of the research design. It's really necessary for the data that we want to collect, and of course that our research participants are informed about it and give their consent, knowing full the risks that they're going to be signing on for. Finally, we want to always, if possible, have confidentiality in terms of the research participants and the identities of the folks who are part of our research project. So if we can do that, in a lot of cases we can when we're doing things like the methods that we've discussed in this class, surveys, interviews, there's usually no reason we need to use names. Community-based research complicates that a little bit, and I'll mention that at the end of this lecture. some of the special research ethics considerations, including confidentiality, that go along with community-based research approaches. But for the most part, we want to maintain confidentiality when we can. Note that confidentiality is not the same thing as anonymity. If someone's anonymous, that means we actually have no idea who they are and their role in our research. A good example would be if we did a probabilistic sample of a population where we're picking names out of a hat, and we as the researcher actually don't know who's involved. So say there's just a number on a ticket we pull out, or a randomized process where we assign people into our sample, and we don't actually know who's participating. And in that case, we can say that it's anonymous and that we don't really have a record of their participation. Otherwise, if there's some record, like if we have a list of interview participants or something like that, where the researcher actually knows who participated, which interview they did, and so forth, the best we can promise there is confidentiality. So those are not necessarily the same terms, and usually what we're promising is confidentiality, not anonymity, except in cases where there's total anonymity and we don't even know who participated. Also remember that confidentiality, when we promise that, we're only promising that to the extent provided by the law. Ideally, this will never happen to us as researchers, but it could happen that if there's a legal case or a lawsuit or some kind of crime, and the research that we're doing reveals some kind of information that's relevant to the investigation that happens with that, our records could be subpoenaed as part of a court case. And this does sometimes happen to researchers. Again, we hope it doesn't happen to us. But when we're promising confidentiality, we're not promising it to the extent that we would be able to save our data, our records, and keep them away from the court. We don't have any special privileges like that. Like if you ever watch Law and Order or shows like that, where doctors or therapists can claim some kind of patient doctor privilege in terms of confidentiality. We as researchers don't have that ability. So it means that when we're promising confidentiality, it's to the extent provided by the law. As I said earlier in this lecture, research ethics and whether or not research projects and proposals meet the ethical standards of our research communities and our communities more general is something that's assessed by an IRB, or Institutional Review Board. Colgate has an IRB that is a local board of faculty, staff, and community members that screens research proposals to make sure that they meet standards of ethical research practices. It's important to note that there are community members that are part of these boards because, as I was saying at the beginning of this lecture, some researchers in the past have had bad track records in terms of really being able to see outside of their own research bubble about what's ethical or not. Again, sometimes it's just a case of being kind of clueless or not being able to understand the full implications of their work. So in that sense, we want to, as researchers, kind of have a check on our research and our sense of ethics by having people from different walks of life and different perspectives who might raise a question and say, hey, what's going on here? Why are you doing this? Why do you think it's a good idea to do this? And that's why there's kind of a broad representation on these IRBs. The Department of Psychology is usually the department at Colgate that is the head of the IRB. There's usually a chair that's a psychologist, and then a lot of the other social sciences and other departments and programs that use research with human participants would also be members on those boards and would do some of the review work for a proposal that's submitted. All this is guided under federal policy that specifies that any institution, including Colgate, that gets federal funds, so if we get a grant from the National Science Foundation or the NIH or the National Endowment for the Humanities, those are all dollars that come from the government, and that's the strings they pull, or those are the carrots and sticks that they have for making sure that we stay in compliance with federal policy in terms of research ethics. So there is actually kind of a legislative and a policy basis for this work, in addition to us thinking that it's a good thing, that we should have this, we should do it so that we can be ethical researchers. When you're considering whether or not you need to actually submit a proposal for the IRB, you can think about the three categories of proposals that the IRB considers. They have full reviews, expedited reviews, and exempt research. Let's start with the third one last. Exempt research is any kind of research that either is research that doesn't really involve direct participation with human participants, or it's considered no higher risk than the risk of everyday living. So for example, say you were using some census data to do some analysis. That's data that's collected from human participants, but you didn't actually do it. So that would be considered exempt because it's data that already exists. Other things where, like say you wanted to do a survey in a class of environmental studies students, and it wasn't really a project that was considered for research purposes beyond that class. You're doing it just to kind of learn the process of developing a survey. It's not going to be published anywhere. It's not going to be presented to the community. In that case, it's purely for kind of class-related or pedagogical purposes. That would also be considered exempt research that doesn't necessarily need to be reviewed by the IRB. You have to report it to them usually. So you can say, I'm doing this research, I consider it exempt, and they'll usually say, yes, we agree with you, as long as you have a good rationale for that. An expedited review is a review that does involve research that's going to be disseminated in some way, either through a report or a presentation or something that will get outside the bounds of a classroom. But it doesn't involve any kind of risk that's above kind of a minimal level. And it doesn't involve populations that can't give informed consent. So a lot of the research that's done in ENST 390 and other student projects would be considered expedited review, and those are done on a rolling basis throughout the year and usually take around a week or so for the IRB to review them and to get back to you. The full review is the highest level of review, and they only do this twice a year. So you've got to make sure that you get it in early in the semester if you need to do a full review. A good example of a proposal that would require a full review would be something that's riskier, that involves some kind of questions about confidentiality or some kind of risk to people's social standing and reputation, or it involves a population that can't give their own consent. A good example is minors under the age of 18. They're not allowed to give their own consent because they're not grown-ups yet. So if you want to do research with kids, you have to get their parents' permission for signing on for informed consent, and you have to go through a full review because they're a protected population and they're seen as a vulnerable population because they can't give their own consent. Same thing for people who are imprisoned or otherwise in some institution where they don't actually have full control over their lives. They're also considered a protected population and unable to give informed consent in that way. Somebody who had a mental illness or some other thing that prevented them from being able to understand the consent form or the consent process, those would also be folks who are protected populations, and you would need to go through a full review to make sure that they do that extra careful study of your proposal and judge it for the ethical content and questions that are a part of it. So probably most of the projects in this course don't require that full level of review unless you say wanted to do something that was related to work with the school and you're going to work with kids who are under the age of 18 or some other kind of situation where you have a protected population, or it's a question that's a little bit higher in terms of risk to social standing, reputation, or even physical harm in some way. This is less likely in this class, but it does sometimes happen, and it's good to know about those different categories of review. To learn more about those levels of review and a lot of other stuff that the IRB asks you to do when you're submitting a proposal and getting reviewed, I really recommend that you take a look at their website. They have a comprehensive site that's a part of Colgate's website that includes a lot of models for proposals, how to develop an informed consent form, that is a form you present to your research participants for them to understand what's going to happen being part of your research and for them to sign on and give their consent if they will. So take a look at that and make sure you understand all the elements that are part of it, and we'll actually look at some examples in class too that give a little bit more detail about the different elements of things like a consent form and how to develop your proposal. Finally, let's talk about some research ethics considerations that I think are relevant or maybe unique to community-based research. Obviously, community-based research is a form of research, so whatever ethical considerations that we would more broadly consider for research purposes, we would do the same. But remember that community-based research has very specific goals through collaboration, emphasizing democratic decision-making process and opening up the process of knowledge creation to make it more democratic, and putting social justice and change as a key goal for CBR type work as well. Those are all critiques of our traditional knowledge production process that we have in academia. And for that reason, they all kind of raise somewhat unique ethical challenges that are related to that community-based approach and the ideals that it has. So for example, confidentiality might be harder to maintain if we want to be fully collaborative. If there's a blurry boundary between who's the researcher and who's the researched or who's a participant in the research, then it maybe makes it harder to sometimes fully promise confidentiality to research participants if we're writing up a project and the people who are in the community are also clearly kind of identifiable in some way because of their role in participating in the research. Maybe we can't always promise confidentiality. That's not necessarily going to be the thing that is make or break for our research. Again, the principle of informed consent means that there can be that risk as long as people are fully aware of it when they're going in and that they sign on and consent for it as part of that process. So we just have to be kind of aware of that and make sure people understand what they're getting into before they fully get into it. The justice orientation also means that if we're really focused on equity, social change, we have a particular stake, a particular stance in the community, and that we're in a way kind of like fighting for something, that we want to advance sustainability or we want to promote justice. And sometimes that might challenge the powers that be, challenge existing interests. So it means that we're not really neutral. I mean, no research is really neutral. It's all got a political value to it and motivation. But in CBR, it's a little bit less hidden. It's something that we put more central in our research, and for that reason, it may mean that sometimes tensions, sometimes again those lines between the researcher and the community member get kind of blurry. And again, we want to make sure that we put that out front early on so that people know kind of what our agenda is and that our research goals are in part about that process of change. Because IRB boards are a little bit more focused usually on traditional research models, they're not always as familiar with community-based research methods, and they might not always be looking out for these concerns. So in some cases, if there's a research project that's oriented towards change in a community, but it's not really meant for publication or wider dissemination, they might actually think it's exempt research. And at the same time, it still could pose challenges in terms of what I was just saying, confidentiality, tensions around justice or equity orientation and challenging existing power structures. So it means that maybe we need to kind of highlight those and explain it in our proposal to kind of make sure the IRB is considering that, or it may mean that we need to take on that for ourselves and just really be careful about it and really be in dialogue with our participants. And I think that's the bottom line. The community-based research methods, we want to set shared goals, we want to set shared methods with our community partners, and early on we really need to bring these issues out into the open, have a dialogue about them, and see if we can come to some kind of common ground where we agree what the ethical rules of engagement are on some of these principles of ethical research. So as I said, we'll see some more examples, specific examples of these in class, and have a chance to talk about them and answer any questions. See you then.